Hi.
The usual suspects.
I'm afraid so. It's a bit depressing, isn't it? I'm just having a quick look at your points that you put in the Dropbox. So yeah, that could be augmented a bit with some extra stuff. So I'll have a look at that.
Yeah, I sort of felt there was quite a lot of text which could be arranged in
around that.
Yeah,
I'll have a go at that later.
Give it a sort of backbone, really.
Well, that's fine. I'll try and do a bit. I'm homeschooling after this, but after that I can. How was the birthday party?
Oh, the birthday party was great. We I showed you the photo, didn't I?
You did, yes. Nice photo of them. Lovely photo.
That was them when they delivered our birthday cake, and so they
Yeah.
cooked 2 birthday cakes, one for us and one for them, and we did the present swap.
Yes, he looked very perky, standing there with his bag of presents.
Well, you would, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. And does he look like a small Dennis?
I'm not sure what he looks like. He's very blonde. It sort of looks like it's sort of looks rather like sunshine. So it is.
Yeah,
nice.
I didn't know which. Maybe his father's blonde.
No, dark haired. No, they, it sort of runs in the family, sort of typically being sort of fair haired at birth, but sort of getting more sort of
my two both
middle of the road, sort of brown later on.
Yeah, both my daughters
stayed blonde.
Yeah. No, both the girls had, golden curls as toddlers, but that went a long time ago. Anyway.
Hello. How are you both this morning?
Okay, thank you. You?
Yes.
Dennis, the article you found is very interesting.
Hmm?
The article you found.
I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. But
I just took a quick look, but yeah, it looks like it will be an excellent reference, I guess.
Yeah. I thought, I sort of thought on reflection that actually the kind of sort of language that's being used in the WHO panel report, I mean, it would be very useful stuff for an introduction to the whole challenges volume, really. So that's as well as helping with writing the politics and policy bit. We seem to have Chris. Hello, Chris.
Yeah, sorry, I was just writing in the chat that you seem not to have my video. We're not sure. I'm just saying in the chat that I've just come straight off another meeting that I didn't expect to run right up until 10, so I just need to replenish my nerve.
fair enough.
Give us a mountain or two.
Duncan, that's good.
Hello.
Morning.
Morning.
Everyone has clocked that there's another new Zoom link.
That's well, they shouldn't change anymore now. So
Yeah.
hopefully everybody will be all right.
Yeah. I'm very open to suggestions on what the best thing is to do from now on. In terms of, do we want to try and sew it all together or look at the new pieces that have been written? Happy to do whichever order anyone would like.
What would you prefer?
I don't mind really. It's difficult to, I find it difficult to read things and comment on them immediately.
I think we
This
were
is-
a bit like that, or at least I do.
There's also a style thing. I suppose we've all written our bits in our own, well, what we think is the style of the paper, which may not be the same for everyone.
Well, I only got Dennis's start on the first couple of sections this morning, so I haven't done my bit yet. So before anything else, I need to
Oh, yeah.
actually write a bit and try and pad that out a bit more.
It looks like we're coming on well though. We have something written for everything now, which is a great start.
Right, so you've got to look at me instead of the mountain again. And but by the way, Duncan, do you know do you know that sometimes your picture goes bright green?
No, I didn't.
No, it just I did. Anyone else see Duncan's picture go bright green?
No.
Oh, right.
Okay, it's got your picture occasionally goes bright green on my Zoom, and apparently that's just me.
Ah, yours does, but that's the mountain. Oh, right.
I do remember, but I'm not sure whether it was Duncan. It might have been quite a long time ago, well before Christmas. We had a meeting with somebody where they kept turning into a sort of alien monster.
Oh, I think that was me. Yes.
But, you know, this sort of green, slimy sort of appearance.
Reflects the mood.
But it may not have been you, but it was on one particular meeting, and I don't ever recall it happening before or since. And I've no idea you know, where that was, but it was only one person, so one rather assumes it was their end rather than mine, but you know. Anyway, we'll look forward to seeing you transformed. Or not.
It wasn't specific. Yes, it wasn't a specific Zoom option like the sort of party hats people were doing. at the party.
Not that I know of.
Yeah, that would have been quite good for the Christmas party, for Christmas party calls. If you had one of these platforms with filters, like I think Facebook Messenger does. But I think these ones we use for work, they don't seem to have these things where you can turn yourself into a werewolf or wear a party hat or have kind of silly games where you catch things on your head. Or...
I think that's the trouble with being an academic, isn't it? You have to use everybody else's systems, so you never quite you never get one perfect. It's all just trying to.
Morning, Ben, carry on. So what would you like us to do, Lisa? Would you like us to sort of go briefly through all the sections and see where we've got to and comment on those? Or
yeah, so it's kind of up to what we feel. I think after this meeting, I'll take them all and just put it into one document. And then if people are able to read through and add comments to sort of one central document, maybe sometime before Friday. And then if there's comments on your section, you can kind of incorporate those before Tuesday is what I was thinking. In terms of what to do now, we can go through sort of the new ones as we've done before. I appreciate it's difficult to give comments on something that you haven't looked at previously. It's often easier to read and reflect over some time.
But perhaps if each person gave a very quick outline of what they were trying to achieve in what they've written, it might help us to see how it all fits together. Or,
yeah, that's true. Yeah. And actually, as Duncan said, it might be helpful for us to kind of see what style each person has gone for, and maybe we can agree. Well, hopefully we can agree on a common style.
Yeah, we need to decide how we're embedding the challenges, don't we? Whether they're sort of theorem style within, or headings, section headings, or whatever. So, yeah.
In our very first sort of working document that we had back in December, we split everything by sort of stage of epidemic. But I think we've sort of come up with our own kind of natural order now. Yeah, so we might not need that. Okay.
So what should we be looking at?
Shall we start with 10.1 and 2? So Dennis.
Yeah,
The file that Dennis uploaded.
Yeah, at the moment it is really rather just a sort of sketch or structure for it. I think there's I wasn't meaning to throw away some useful stuff which people have contributed earlier, but thinking more if you had a sort of backbone like this, that you could organise some detail around these sort of points.
Yes, I think the next.
And I also think, I also think that there's an interesting panel report from WHO's independent panel that I circulated this morning, would help actually with being a bit more precise on some of these points. Well, actually, I mean, I've got a whole stack of articles I've been collecting through the pandemic, which sort of say things on these. I was thinking that, and having got this, also got this all structure, this all successive stages I wanted to talk about, I could go back and look at what other people have said about them, and try and distill that into something that is most clearest and most helpful for modelers and scientists wanting to contribute on the point, as opposed to people just wanting to elect different politicians or whatever. So I'm happy to carry on doing a bit of work on this. Maybe I think Valerie was going to chip in on this one too.
Yes. So so now that you've done that bit, I'll try and go back to Lisa's original document where we all flung in ideas, and try and pad, allocate those to this, and try and sort of pad this out a bit. And I'll try and do that in the next next couple of days anyway. Maybe I'll have a bit of time tomorrow or this evening to have a go at that. So I'll try and do that fairly quickly.
I think my other remark is I think I would keep the sections separate for a little bit longer, because I think we might have questions about reordering, or whether some of them need sort of integrating or redistributing or something. I mean, maybe I'm wrong there, but
Yeah.
It's going to be easier to do if they are already, if they're kept in sort of bite-sized chunks for the moment.
Yeah. I mean, are there any? Do you have any thoughts, or other? I haven't had the chance to look at the WHO review panel report yet. Is there anything there about how all this is set in the context of the WHO being in some sense a sort of voluntary cooperation without having exactly having authority?
I think that's an issue they touch on. Yes, I'm pretty sure. Yes.
Because that's where you to an even greater extent than in other circumstances, that's maybe something where inevitably anyone's thoughts of what is in some sort of altruistic sense the right thing to do gets mixed up in the politics of the situation, because it's probably to an even greater extent than at national level you get all kinds of competing interests.
I think that's very right. Having sat in on not WHO but UN type calls, you can see they're diplomats at the end of the day. At least at the most senior level, and therefore it's a diplomatic process, not even a political process. It's trying to not offend anybody. So you've got this, it's rather like the policymakers in as you were saying, in countries. You've got the politicians plus the modelers, and I think they're trying to serve two roles at the same time. So,
well, I mean, for instance, a couple of their sort of executives summary, I think it's a sort of earlier page, that's sort of probably more summary. On page 6, there's a paragraph headed "The Global Pandemic Alert System's Not Fit for Purpose," talking about how the procedures and protocols seem to come from an earlier analog era and need to be brought into the digital age. And then a little bit further down, there's a one about headed "The World Health Organization has been underpowered to do the job expected of it. The incentives for cooperation are too weak to ensure the effective engagement of states," so on. So I think it's very much is addressing these kind of points.
But I think that the one point that could be made is that you don't necessarily have to create an entirely new system. You could improve the WHO type systems rather than recreating them. Or you could.
No, I think my impression is that the sort of framework of the WHO is pretty much just the thing we need, and I think, I mean, I would guess the independent panel's standpoint is that what they would like to see is WHO strengthened and supported better, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think I find it difficult to imagine an international coordination system that wasn't effectively reinventing WHO. So tearing it up and starting again and producing something. I can't be an answer, because I think that would just run into the same problems of you've got at the moment. What you need to do is to look at the problems and say, why is it not working well enough? How do we persuade governments to give it the powers and to support it and to make it into a system that reacts, give it oil its wheels so that it works faster when required.
And it's very difficult, isn't it? Because the sort of global response to the, say, European response, to the UK response, to the English response, they're all sort of tiers of in a hierarchy of responses. But essentially, we don't elect the WHO, we elect our politicians, and our politicians are responsible for hopefully keeping us alive.
Yeah, there's probably also when thinking about those kinds of issues, we we need to have an eye on the fact that while we have some views, international geopolitics isn't our own specialism. So we may not want to place too much emphasis in report on these issues beyond what we see from our particular perspective.
But I think, isn't that why? I mean, I feel a report like this is very valuable as giving a reasonably dispassionate but hard-hitting sort of critique from the outside. So we can use that as a clear indication that problems exist, and as I say, and the bulk of what we should be doing is from a modeler's scientist point of view of how can we contribute and so on. But I feel that you need that sort of background as to what is the practical point of doing this, why is it needed, and to have something which is written from a sort of international political standpoint that says these are problems, these are things that haven't worked, is very valuable, because then if we can say, we don't have to argue there's a problem. You see what I mean? We can say it's clear from this and other references. I wouldn't only want to give one reference. I want to give but it's clear from this that there's a problem of not doing things fast enough. There's a problem. There are problems to do with not integrating data systems. Say.
That's obviously all fine. It's just, I mean, what I was meaning is just that we don't want to be when we're adding in our own from content, for want of a better word, or as opposed to the reviewing authoritative sources. We don't want to stray too far outside our own our areas where we do claim specialist expertise.
Yeah, sure.
But I guess, I mean, we can say reasonably things like, the need for data to inform the models, and this need to be, these need to be collected worldwide, international standards, etc., etc. So, and obviously the extent to which organisations like WHO can assist with that is.
And I think while while a report like this will maybe talk about essentially for political reasons why governments don't collaborate as much as they should. I mean, we can talk about the structure of research and research support and science, and how that can be made to work better. I mean, there's the question. I mean, that comes up a lot is that things like individual countries having using different scientific support systems and using different models and so on, and there certainly has been a tendency for each country to do its own modelling, and presumably some of them have done it much better than others, and the trick is to that's my cup of coffee being delivered. Thank you. And the trick is to try and put one's finger on how much modelling how much there can be in the way of collaboration and cross-fertilization in modelling, while at the end of the day, each particular country is going to want control of modelling its own pandemic. If they're trying to, if you're in Italy trying to predict the number of intensive care beds you need a couple of months down the line because of the way the pandemic's going, you're not going to want that to be done, I assume, by a sort of single world model run by the WHO in Geneva or something. You're going to want to do your local Italian modelling, but equally, and that probably is the best way to do it, provided that the best Italian modelling is making use of, you know, the best pandemic modelling worldwide. You know, if people in other countries have come around to recognising that the important things in transmission are certain, there are certain aspects of transmission between groups or individuals that really need to be taken into account to model the pandemic well, you in Italy don't want to be running a model which still doesn't incorporate that feature.
I suppose one way around that is sort of following on what Valerie was saying, is to get systematic collection of data. So if people have data in a way that can then be put into models, then
I think there's obviously there's best practice in data, but there's also, I suppose, best practice in modelling, which is you know, recognising. Well, I suppose we're probably straying into Challenge 6's territory here. There's trying to acknowledge that different models and modelling different aspects of pandemic are very useful, but you need some kind of overview as far as possible of how they all fit together. So and hopefully broad agreement as to what kind of models are needed for what kind of things, you know, models for assessing non-pharmaceutical interventions.
Well, I suppose that's an interesting, you know, we're talking about the WHO. I'm not sure if they had, I may be extremely wrong, it's just ignorance, whether they had a sort of model that countries could use, or whether it was all left down to the individual countries to do it. I suppose they must have done, but I'm not aware of them.
Imperial through WHO helped with a few things, because Imperial is their like external modelers, but I don't know.
Yeah, I didn't know
They
that.
sort of officially had something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's lots of countries in which that sort of thing would have been beneficial, certainly. I mean, we're quite well set up here, but
Yeah.
that's not the case for everywhere, of course.
Difficult, isn't it? Because I mean, if you have a really big model, you know, and all singing, all dancing, every possible
Country.
connection sort of in there. Well, not necessarily every country, but you know, a very, very detailed model, then in principle it could be applied anywhere. And but in practice, of course, you don't really want that. You want much simpler structures that reflect the parts of the system that are important to your country. And of course, these are going to vary depending on sort of contact structures. I mean, obviously, simple things like age breakdowns and so on can be sort of input, but other I think other structures as to what is important about contact is going to vary quite a lot. And so when you think about the simpler models, some of them will be appropriate in some contexts, some countries, but not for others, and not easily tweakable to make them so. But I don't know.
And I suppose, you know, as we're sort of looking at the policy side of things, you need to make sure that the policy makers understand at least the outputs from the models. So it's almost, you know, that the training of, it's rather like they've got a tool, a calculator that they know how to use before they need to use it. And I suppose it's that stage that perhaps gets overlooked. Because, you know, they may have lots of people coming to them and say, here's my model, or here's my prediction. You know, so how do they know that? Is the familiarity with the sort of charts and the outputs that come out of these models could be improved, I think.
And I mean, as usual, if you have some sort of centrally, strategically planned modelling activity, which in some sense has primacy, then you obviously get some advantages from that, but you also get disadvantages prominent among them, that you then don't get diversity of thinking, or anyway you tend to pick up a lot of inertia on the incumbent approach.
Yeah, it's rather like you know, governments have a first aid kit, and this is the model they bring out and sort of use. And then maybe, you know, the first aid kit is 20 years old and past its sell-by date.
Yeah, and well, this is where again, I mean, things to again drawing on. I always popped up with another one on experience from energy systems earlier, where when you're talking about if you kind of abolish the WHO, you'd have to set up a new one. It's exactly like that when people talk about abolishing Ofgem, the energy regulator. You've just got to have a new regulator. I mean, you do see that to some extent where incumbent approaches, which tend to be based on very large scale linear program models, you have these incumbent approaches in support for energy policy, and it's very difficult to get your voice heard except in the sort of very specialist end of the community, because it's only the sort of mainstream incumbent approach that has something really to put on the table as a full-scale example. And you need many person years of effort to get to the if you're looking at a different approach to get to the stage where you really have something to put on the table as a fully worked alternative.
Well, coming back to the point about bigger full single dancing models, and I think one of the points about any kind of sort of official best practice model is it's going to date as time goes by. I mean, I think Neil Ferguson's Imperial College model was probably, well, in some ways at least, state of the art when it was constructed, maybe around about the time of the SARS epidemic. But over the 15 or 20 years since then, it had been sort of the way people do with adjusting computer programs. It just had bits bolted on and bits edited and so on, and until it was, it was really rather resembled an old car that's had new bits welded on and new panels replaced and painted over or whatever. So if you are having large scale models, I mean, of course, presumably large scale models obviously need the flexibility to deal with the different kinds of epidemics that might come along, but that's another problem. But even supposing you had an authoritative, wonderful full scale model, you really would want a rolling program where every 5 or 10 years people sat down and said, if we were developing this kind of model today, would we really do it that way? Or, and the answer will usually be no, we'd do it this way. And so you learn from the old model and you produce a brand new, fresh model, which will do you the next 5 years. So,
and going back to the sort of Cygnus thing, the what's it called? Playing at pandemics. I imagine the models were used to inform policymakers, and they were all in the room. And then the policymakers went away and said, what would we do? But I'm not sure if the feedback from the policymakers went into the, updating of the model. So it's this kind of two-way symbiotic type relationship.
Again, when some approach or group, which is often the same thing, have incumbency in a sense, and it can go different ways. I mean, sometimes I can't think of where I've got direct experience of this. They, to put it politely, they will take an approach like that, but sometimes they will keep on developing within the same basic framework, whether because that's partly because simply that's what they know how to do without bringing other people in, and that's what they know how to do while maintaining leadership, and sometimes I think partly because that's just the easy way to go, that you get your you can keep going on like that for at least half of a career, and it's probably a slower and harder road to keep reinventing yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, although we can always think of a better model, and we know the imperial model has been sort of, as Dennis said, kind of added and swapped around. But should we also consider if that might be not so important, if perhaps the kind of relationships that they already have set up and the, I guess, connections and kind of communications, everybody in the office knows exactly what to do when a pandemic starts. You know, they already have the kind of government links. I'm wondering if that's more important than having an up-to-date model. You know, obviously from our perspective, it seems stupid not to have the best thing you can have. But
well, I suppose maybe the best of both worlds is to have those established incumbent modelling teams.
Yeah.
But also, I mean that's fine if it's right. But
yes, assuming it's right. Yeah.
But I suppose at the same time to have the sort of B team people going on, and resources being set and say, yeah, right, okay, we've got this problem. You, as I don't know, computer scientists or whatever, go and set up a model. Here are what we know. Go and see if you get the same sort of results from an almost entirely new, an entirely new model.
Well, that's the expert judgment people's approach, isn't it? That I think hopefully will get dealt with under Challenge 7, the estimation that that really that people tend to, any one model tends to understate the uncertainty in estimating, predicting what's going to happen, and that you really are much better off if you do have a number of rival groups who are modeling your pandemic in different ways, and then if they come out with, as they very likely will, a range of quite different predictions, where one let's say one of them, I don't know, models that under, just to make it all simple, one of them says that they're predicting that R naught is going to be between 1.3 and 1.6. And another one actually says, no, it isn't, it's going to be between 0.9 and 1.2, coming from a completely different model. If you only have the one group of modelers, you'll be thinking that you can estimate the parameter, whatever it is, within 10%, let's say, and you'll be quite unaware that actually a equally plausible model suggests that it's really quite a different range. So, presumably, so may well be the best you can do is just simply say, well, the thing is just much less certain. But and probably in the first instance, you want to have your different groups of modelers, and you want to have some people trying to come to some kind of reasonable judgment as to some kind of weighted average and wider uncertainty bounds because of the uncertainties. And of course, going forward, you want people to look at why these models are disagreeing like that, and hopefully, if people get a better understanding of why the models are disagreeing, then in next time round, 6 months or a year or whenever, next time round you come to the same kind of estimation challenge, you'll do rather better, because perhaps you realized that you absolutely needed data on something to be able to estimate this properly. And because of that realization, people have now got better data on whatever that aspect is. So
Yeah.
it's that fluidity of different ideas and different approaches is just in conflict with the, it's two good ideas. One good idea is you want to have lots of opinions and to research challenge and new models come forward. And another one, of course, is at any one moment, what you'd dearly love to have is one big authoritative model that tells you what to do. And of course, politicians tend to err in that direction because they really like, well, perhaps they don't. Perhaps they like to have their own pet modeler who makes predictions that they like. But that's.
Oh, I'll send a couple of. I'm just checking what's in one report, which is the sort of most recent official, properly written version of my thinking here that I've produced, but it's not directly relevant. I can also send a slightly off the wall blog thing I wrote a few years ago, which I'm currently revising on this. But I think this also forms part of the matters about affecting change, because if you're having some strategic planning about how you're going to be prepared for decision support in emergency circumstances, then these are these are issues that you have to confront, because when it comes to having to have modeling outputs in the next week, that's only going to come from people who are already pretty well set up. And so if there's going to be some sort of strategic planning of how this sort of somewhat informal, decentralized community of people who give advice is set up, and how how it develops its capabilities, you need to think about how you're going to bring in new ideas. I'm just checking. Yes, this point is in a report that I was the lead author for. There's a report for Centre for Digital Built Britain on planning infrastructure, but a lot of it applies equally well to this. So I'll put this in the chat, and I'll also put in the chat this blog article about energy systems modeling. I mean, most of this blog article that I wrote still stands. It's just that I'd probably write it. I wrote this about 4 years ago, so I'd probably write it better these days. Sorry, that's not the. So I've just pasted the same thing again. This is the blog piece coming through now. There's a bit there under the quote of Who Watches the Watchmen, about these issues of, for instance, peer review. That one important thing with peer review of processes or particular pieces of work is who's picking the peer reviewers. So if you end up with people from the mainstream writing peer reviews, then you end up with the people from the mainstream keeping getting the grants. I mean, I'm actually currently in a correspondence with EPSRC on this in the context of energy systems, because I wrote occasionally I get fed up with receiving terrible proposals to review that basically don't say anything about how they're going to, about what methodology they're going to use. They're just a list of kind of high level aims. And I write to EPSRC saying, I want to be constructive here. I just don't want to keep giving stinking reviews, but all the proposals you're sending me, I think are terrible for the same reason. Would you like to have a chat about it? And then generally they respond quite positively about the idea of having a chat, and then spend another year or two receiving rubbish proposals to review. And I write to them again.
We came into this discussion from a starting point of thinking about the sort of international aspects of models and so on. And the argument, which I think is very persuasive, that one needs lots of complementary, well, ideally complementary groups, or groups producing complementary models that give a range of things that you can weigh together, is, I'm sure, right within a country, but it makes it much harder to promote that sort of thing internationally, where you would like to be much more prescriptive and say sort of, you know, do this, or and where particular approaches, because the range of approaches is not going to apply equally in each place that you're talking about. So you need a different group probably of different modeling groups, if you see what I mean. So it's hard to see quite how best practice model wise can be, I'm not putting this very well, but you know, how recipes for that can be really explained, and it's much easier to be able to say you should be collecting these sorts of data, you know, because that's fairly concrete, and then of course you can say, well, you need models that will use those, but the actual model construction seems much harder to give guidance on.
Can you not say that your model should include these processes? A good model models these things, whereas a bad model would ignore them.
I think I think that's right, because we've thought about this. I mean, I'm wearing again energy systems again, where I'm part of some IEEE standards activities. This is a sort of ongoing discussion that there's often a desire to be very prescriptive in recommendations of how modelling should be done. And my general response is basically what Peter said, that that it's just almost going against the nature of how modelling should be done to try and provide people with detailed recipes, but you can certainly give recommendations as to what should be taken into account. And that is a very useful thing. I mean, this is actually again coming back to the sort of discussion that was actually mainly Duncan and me last time about the Aquabook. That's kind of what the Aquabook does. It's not prescriptive about individual circumstances, but looking very broadly across government, it gives some extremely good kind of high level goals. Of course, the thing that the piece of the jigsaw that the Aquabook, again, as per the discussion last week, or the Aquabook project didn't really have, is the follow-up on how you implement this broadly.
Okay. I think lots of what we've said would probably be included quite well in the kind of introductory 1-2 sections.
There is some quite nice working climate models on combining. Well, there's a couple of very nice papers by Richard Chandler.
Mm.
And I think we should probably include those in a combining models section, and I'm happy to write something. I mean, it is in a different context, and there are differences, but Richard's papers lay out quite a nice theoretical way of how you might combine different models. He doesn't give any real solutions, but
do you think that goes in here or more in the estimation or
I don't
There's
know.
a bit in 10.7 already about that.
There's a section with the heading, isn't there, Ben?
Yeah, so I haven't written extensively, and it would definitely warrant some specific references like Richard's papers. But yeah, I definitely think it. You know, there's the scope for it to go in this particular paper. There's obviously links with the estimation as well. But
Yeah, I tend to think of the estimation of individual models and then combining models as a sort of the next process where you do things like Bayesian model averaging or the cleverer things that Richard suggested. The sort of next step.
Is that combining outputs of the models?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it's in the context. You know, you predict temperature rise in 2050, and how do you advise people on emissions policy and get a sensible number out of lots of disparate modelers doing things. So yeah. It's a very similar problem, but it's always easier because the models aren't stochastic. So you there's that extra bit of I don't like to use the word noise, that extra bit of uncertainty that comes from the stochasticity in the model. So everything's much fuzzier here than it is with climate. But I think that the same theoretical framework could be expanded.
About multi-models and things like that in the modelling paper, but I don't think we specifically discuss how to combine outputs, which I think is what you are more going for. So yeah, I don't, yeah, it sounds, as Ben said, I think it could fit here. Okay, did we want to look at some of the paragraphs that people have written?
Should we just go through the next one? Is that?
Yeah. So 10.3. Oh, is Kerry-Ann around? I know she has various homeschooling projects. Here you are there.
I am here. I'm listening quietly because there's live history in the background. If you can speak, did you want to give a quick sort of sentence or two about what you were aiming for? Yeah, so I just really tried to work with the bullet points and then put together some of my ideas probably as well. It's quite wordy, but so working through, so some of it's I think talked about in the discussion in the introduction just now when you were talking, but why we need international cooperation, what's required for effective cooperation. So in terms of training and trying to deal with this dominance of a small number of groups. What can we do to help all countries have equal access to expertise? And then this idea of duplicated effort and what can we do about that and when does it apply? So thinking about if we're calculating R, then maybe that calculation can be applied internationally with the same models, providing we've got the same kind of data. But then moving on to, if we're looking at very specific policies, then we need to take into account regional variation in behaviour and environment, etc. And so one global model is unlikely to do the job. And then the idea of ensemble modeling as well, which is sort of something that's been talked about a lot, not really applied much because it's very hard to do. So it's not referenced particularly, but it's, yeah.
So you've covered
My
a
essay on
lot
it.
of the things we've been talking about this morning already, which is absolutely great.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Daddy, do you want to bite on my?
What's that?
It's a jam sandwich.
Jam sandwich.
It was from my English.
Wow. Thank you.
Feel free.
Let's
Have
try
a
that.
bite.
I'll have
Yeah.
to bite. That's delicious. Part of an English lesson, apparently. Making a jam
Quite-
sandwich.
quite-
How is that English?
I don't know.
Mhm.
Oh, that looks really good.
Yeah, I like the bit about
super.
also including equal access to expertise. I don't think we'd mentioned that much before.
So I'm very conscious that there are some initiatives like the Gates Foundation who do try to combine local expertise with basically American and British expertise, but trying to get that idea. And I mean, one thing that's been very noticeable when you talk about African work is that we're merrily saying things about abattoirs, and then you talk to them about abattoirs, and abattoirs are actually small people, small businesses killing 10 animals, whereas we think of abattoirs as thousands of animals going through. And so our whole network idea of how disease would transmit through abattoirs is wrong for Africa.
Mm. Is there much sort of, you know, models being shared internationally? So you mentioned Africa, for example. So is there a sort of move, or should there be a move to models being models being able to be used by decision makers within Africa, for example, within individual countries?
So within the Gates, so our group's funded, but I don't work on the Gates projects, but it's funded to do modelling of wheat rust and cassava brown streak disease by the Gates Foundation. And that's very much tries to be collaborative with a lot of local scientists as well, so that we're not the ones that are controlling everything. It's supposed to be working together. But ultimately the simulation is in our lab in Cambridge. But the idea is that it's working together and that we should be able to hand something over to them. The practice is harder.
I suppose it's, you know, the difference with handing something over as opposed to, you know, this symbiotic thing where, you know, ideally policymakers within, you know, an African country government are sitting down actually you know, playing with the model and able to get the visualizations out that they can see what's happening in their individual country, for example, ideally, but it's easier said than done.
Yeah, so we can give them tools to play with. It's the difficulty is with models making sure that they interpret them correctly and don't manipulate them to their own particular policy objective, as it were.
Not just a problem, it's a worldwide problem, I think, isn't it, really?
Yeah. So the Gates Foundation is doing that. The Wellcome Trust were doing it through our infectious disease dynamics course in the people who say a certain proportion of the attendees are always from Africa and Asian countries. And they're often people that are working by themselves, desperately trying to understand anything. Unfortunately, the Wellcome Trust decided last year or the year before to stop funding our course because the bioinformatics people felt that because we didn't have any bioinformatics in it, it wasn't relevant to them. So now they're feeling silly. No. but yeah, that kind of course, I think, but we're not the only ones that were running courses. There's courses from Tropical School, and I think there's a couple of American courses, a couple of Australian.
And presumably Chinese as well.
Presumably, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a long tradition of Chinese students being sent to Britain and America to learn.
I was thinking in Africa though. I mean, you know, there's a sort of, you know, whose models do you use? You know, it's almost like whose vaccines do you use? You know.
So I think there's a drive away, and Caroline Trotton probably knows a lot more about this, from Brits and Americans taking the money, doing the work, delivering a model which actually completely misses the entire behavioural structure and environmental variables, towards trying to get integrated modelling groups that have on-the-ground modelers supported by UK, American, well-resourced modelers.
Well, I suppose that's, you know, essentially the difference between doing it now and doing it 20 years ago is that yeah, you can join seminars all around the world and you can see lots of stuff and set up models and get something running very quickly.
So yeah. I've tried to add in the comments about connections. So somebody had put a bullet point about local connections being important. And I think from the point of view of the INI workshop, one of potential pitfalls is that joining it was very much a connected network of people who knew each other, inviting each other. And so those small workers in government organisations around the country who nobody knows never have been invited because they don't publish anything. They're on their own within a government organisation. And so how do you make sure that those people get integrated so that they can be supported?
I think that's, you know, say from my own sort of looking at the Operational Research Society thing, you know, you had all these people who were doing or could be useful for this, but because they weren't already embedded in the system, they found it difficult to become embedded in the system, you know, in the modelling groups, for example. It wouldn't have necessarily made a difference, but you know, those resources weren't being used, I think. And I suppose particularly where different approaches were perhaps, you know, going to be used, they weren't one of the models that were looked at, I suppose. So yeah. And you say one mega model is not ideal. Is that because
that was one of the bullet points, but I agree with it.
Yeah.
So if you think about what a mega model is going to include, it's going to have lots and lots of Lego bricks, as it were.
Yeah. That
people can pick and choose from to make it applicable to their country. And you start to go down issues with you've got to facilitate it. So you have something that superficially gives results, but they don't mean anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think again, just looking back to previous points, that I mean, typically having one mega model brings problems, but I think it is important to think through how a decision-making organisation intends to receive useful evidence from modelling, and I mean, what one doesn't wish to do is is end up with a situation when it sort of comes to an emergency situation, and you essentially have to work with what's there and that has been developed in a kind of uncoordinated way.
But how would your mega model work?
Well, no, I'm not referring to a mega model. I'm referring to how the sort of community is organised. Because if you have if you have a community that is where various modelling, modelling lines of work have developed in times when there isn't anything particularly serious going on, basically in research mode, is that going to leave you with something that is useful when you do have an emergency like the current pandemic, and you have to start taking decisions very, very quickly? And I mean, some aspects of that are whether you have the necessary science and whether you have the necessary people connected together. And part of it is matters of whether these groups where you could be relying on, relying heavily on for production modelling, actually have the capabilities to do proper production modelling with production quality code, rather than basically being set up to operate in research mode and then having to make do when it comes to switching to directly advising government.
So I think one thing to think about is the multitude of questions that government can ask. So some of them can be addressed with standard techniques. Like, what's my reproductive ratio at the moment in my country? And some of them are much more required, a much more refined approach. And so I think, so somebody mentioned climate modelling, and I don't know much about it, but we've got a few climate modelers in our group. And one of them gave a presentation talking about, so there's a worldwide sort of system of estimating, and then everybody's got their country level models, and they use that worldwide one to give them boundaries and then feed in their country data. Is there a climate modeler in here? But there's this, so there's this worldwide thing that you can dip into, and your awareness that it might not be that accurate, but it gives you good boundary conditions. And some countries will just use that. And then other countries have got their own satellite data as well, and their own models that they've adapted. So if you're a very hilly country, then your model is going to be different to if you're a very flat country, for example. And so they have a mega model, and then they have these refined within country, and they combine those together. So like we have the Met Office. So my confusion came was, why are you giving me this data from, I can't even remember what it's called, Error 5 data? Why aren't we using Met Office data? And the explanation of the difference between those and what they're feeding in, and some of them are to do with their building up historic data to give. So if I just took raw Met Office data, I just have my point from my stations, and then you have different models that bring together that data, and some of them combine in satellite data and so on. So you get slightly different estimates depending on which model you use. So even climate modelling isn't a single answer. If I go and ask for historic data for last year, I can get several different estimates of what last year looked like.
And there's issues there with resolution as well. So I worked on something kind of similar using Met Office data, and they had two different resolutions, meteorology files, and using the very low resolution meteorology caused major issues in the model because it was just trying to smooth over what you're saying, very hilly data, and one side of the hill versus the top of the hill is very different in terms of wind and all sorts of other important physical properties. So yeah, that's a really important thing to consider as well as resolution of the inputs, and probably has ramifications in terms of epidemiological models as well, I would assume.
But I think one of the things, not so much climate modeling, but weather modeling, weather forecasting, they're incredibly well set up because they do it every day, and they've done it every day forever, effectively. They are incredibly well set up in how they advise people and how they get weather forecasts out to people and such like, because they have a structure that just does that. They're not just some academics who do it as a, when they're not teaching. We have a Met Office, we have a European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, and those are the two, well, and the one in the States, and they produce global forecasts that other people then embed other models within through this really very effective international set of meteorological agencies that work through the World Met Office. Epidemiological modeling doesn't have that, because in a sense we never thought we needed it every day. It was just on tap if we needed it, and I think it's done incredibly well considering where we started from. But if we'd had a thing like the Met Office, it would have done a lot better. And whether we want something like the Met Office, because it's very expensive, and whether you could keep politicians paying for it when we have 10 years without a pandemic, they're going to say, no, we don't want that. But they probably shouldn't. I think you could make a case that it's money well spent.
But I think the Met Office have gone through phases of poor funding as well, where people have decided that we kind of know what's going on now.
Yeah,
that's why they charge for their data, because they have to make money. And so if you're doing research on climate, weather, whatever, you tend to use American data because it's free rather than British data because it's costly. But what I was going to say, I mean, it is a bit different though, isn't it? Because with whether you've got an underlying physical process which you model to a greater or lesser degree depending on the resolution, but underpinning it, you can make your differential equations more and more highly, high resolution to represent the physical process that's going on with more and more detail. And you don't have a cloud suddenly saying, I think I've had enough of this, I'm going home or something. Or, I'm not going to put a mask on today, I'm not going to rain. You don't have any of the sort of behavioral things which have got to go into the epidemic models that make life so difficult.
I think it's interesting about the parallels of the MOD, sorry, the Met Office and this sort of modelling agency or international agency. I think what the Met Office does have to make money, commercially, but that's only because it's been told it has to make money commercially. I mean, it was, I think, it was originally part of the Ministry of Defence, so it was set up with that in mind, and that was a sort of national security imperative, if you like. And perhaps there's a similar sort of thing here that ideally this new modelling agency could be used commercially, but it's also quite useful in times of pandemics too.
But I think a very important thing with agencies like that, I mean, is what the mission of the people is and what the people are rewarded for. Because one of the issues you always have when you have academics in universities being the people who are doing this kind of activity, and it's mixed, whether it's academics or others in whether it's academics or research labs, which aren't part of the sort of normal university business, in this area of epidemiology, but their main thing is publishing papers and producing research outputs in those kinds of ways, and the additional the additional tasks, which are often expensive and require a lot of people time, of getting things into the form where they're really suitable for production use is often, you know, a bit of a secondary matter. Whereas if you have I mean, I usually just use the blanket term national lab type facility, then the people have the individual people, the senior people have a different mission.
Yeah, it's kind of what Kerry
and
right? About
yeah,
you're not incentivized to create papers. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, you're actually. I mean, I mean, it's. I mean, I guess the broad point is that if you want a particular thing, you need to give some people the mission to do that thing.
I think in the UK we have some of the building blocks in terms of public health bodies. We have Public Health England, or whatever they've been renamed to, I don't know, and the ONS collecting data.
Yeah, and
we kind of have Neil Ferguson saying, well, I'll be the thing that brings it all together. But whether that control should be in the hands of one university, really, or whether it should be another research institute that's dedicated to.
Yeah. Well, there are two things. One is whether it should be in the hands of there are two questions there, which I think are separate. One is whether it should be in the hands of one group, and the other is whether it should be within the standard university research setup. Because the problem with it being within the standard university research setup is that frequently it is that the mission of people, the sort of basic mission of people in the universities is, well, to do the research side of this.
Well, I think a fundamental problem with university setup as well is the disposable nature of postdocs. So if I work in a research institute, then I'm given a permanent job. If I work as a university postdoc, I'm given a permanent job, which is subject to funding, and therefore, because at DEFRA funding there's been no forthcoming tree funding, then that postdoc will end, and then DEFRA will turn around to my group leader and go, we want some tree stuff, and he'll go, well, I've lost all my postdocs who are experts in that because they have to go and get other jobs.
Yeah,
this is the sort of nature. This sort of modelling it's not important until it is. Yeah, that's very important. So I think you're right. It's that you know, capability, if you like, within the country or the world of keeping these models going, or keeping the people, you know, the postdocs and researchers researching and keeping their models up to date, even if it's something as trivial as making their code look nice. So that when it is actually used, it's all ready to go, and the capability is there. Yeah, it's rather like the Met Office, right? I'm sure there are some people there, you know, looking at, I don't know, nuclear fallouts from the, you know, 1980s type models, which, you know, suddenly may become very important, you know, but very unlikely to. So you know, it's these sort of rare events, but very high impact events where you ideally should have the capabilities.
And it is funding for that coding. So I'm working on a postdoc, well, a couple of postdocs who left a model that's coded in my lab, and the idea is to publish it, but it's not in a form that another group could currently use it, really. Like, they'd have to spend several weeks. And so if we wanted to get it into a form of a model where people just had to feed in inputs, which cleaned their data for them and went through that process, then that's another, I mean, we need some proper programmers.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a big chunk of work. It's not
no.
a few days work. And I don't think I mean, even within our group, I don't think people necessarily appreciate the time it takes to even produce one pretty plot that can be generalizably created by any user. And so funders don't want to fund, if you put in that amount of computing time, then they'll just go, well, why would it take you so long?
And then I suppose you get on.
Yeah, I think that
thing in terms of everyone can edit your code. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually. I mean, in terms of whether funders will pay for things like this, I'm never quite sure whether it's that there's a reluctance to fund it or whether it's because the question tends not to be asked, because I mean, you could. Because I mean, you really are talking serious amounts of money. I mean, definitely macroscopic relative to the size of a grant, and of course, money that goes on that, as far as the people proposing the work will go, is money not spent on their core business of research. I mean, for what it's worth, the context in which I usually make a comment a bit like that is actually uncertainty treatment, which is another thing that is often regarded as a sort of would-be nice add-on rather than a core part of a modelling study.
I mean,
I'm actually going to have to go very soon.
I've been involved in lab projects where basically a certain head of department, who's no longer in the country, went around asking different modelers to do work for him. And then as soon as you said, after like 3 months of doing something for him, as soon as you're putting a grant in, can you put some money in for me? Because I've just been doing it on the side. He ran off to find the next modeler because he viewed the cost of putting in that extra person in. And it's always just one modeler working on their own as well. So nobody ever goes, actually, maybe a couple of modelers, a team of modelers would do better than one person trying to understand the stats, the differential equations, the coding, the biology,
Anyway, I'm going to have to go very shortly because I've got another meeting adjacent to this, and I just need a few minutes between them.
And I think there isn't a big question. I don't know quite whether our conversation's addressing it. What in an ideal world we would expect WHO to do, and what they would expect them to have capacity for, and what we would expect individual countries to contribute. I mean, there must be some kind of ideal in which WHO provides some kind of basic level of support for efforts all around the world and some kind of modelling capacity, but is also really encouraging best practice where at any one time different modelling groups, I mean, hopefully many of them international, but they could just come from individual countries, are doing work either at their own country level or doing work worldwide. You can imagine a group of a small group of you can imagine an international research project being set up at one particular point to say, well, among research epidemiologists who are dissatisfied with the standard models and trying to do some modeling worldwide and point out why things can be done better. And I mean, that's very healthy that you've got to have a sort of dynamic future in which new solutions come along.
So we need a new International Institute of Mathematical Epidemiology.
Well, maybe would that be WHO, or that would to run that? I mean, WHO obviously do have some capacity. I mean, I'm not really sure how strong their expertise is, and therefore I'm not quite sure how much it needs to be
How much did WHO do actual modelling research, as it were, as opposed to writing reviews,
Well, I think they do.
collecting data?
Yeah, they have in-house epidemiologists,
Yeah.
but they also outsource a lot to Imperial and others.
Yeah, just one final comment on that before I have to go. I think we've got and we can make recommendations or provide thoughts on what on how international cooperation could develop. But I think that I think that it's much more achievable to improve the setup within Britain, and I think that we might regard the we might therefore. Well, actually, where am I heading to with this? We've certainly got to be. I think we've got to be prepared for the fact that it's more likely that will be able to have influence on how this kind of modelling and decision support framework operates in Britain than in the international scene. That's not to say we shouldn't. That's not to say we shouldn't try.
But we can make the UK case generalisable to.
Yeah.
But I think isn't there I'm unhappy at this sort of UK focused approach, really. I mean, to be contrarian, is there a case for the UK saying the UK is actually too big a country to organise this kind of thing well? If you look at New Zealand, maybe it was a strength for New Zealand that they only had a small number of epidemic modelling groups, and it was easier to, who were fortunately, and this may be fortunate, or maybe it's a feature of that, who maybe because they were not too specialised, they were reasonably open-minded and so on, and they provided reasonably high quality advice in a sort of open-minded sort of way to the government, whereas the UK is full of lots and lots of, it's got far more expertise than New Zealand, but it's like a whole sort of Premier League of competing teams. And, I think it's a serious argument that there's a sort of best size of country here, and that the way to tackle that problem is more cross-cutting an international approach. Because what you're trying to, I think part of what I'm seeing as a problem is a sort of pecking order problem, that you have so many people that you have the whole kind of peer review system and so on, in which and research assessment exercises whereby certain universities groups are seen as the best and the top and so on. You get hierarchy. So mind you, that may be just a British thing. The British love sort of class structures, but I do think that we ought to have at least an open mind on what the best kind of cooperative structures among research scientists are for tackling this in the future.
Yeah, I guess I kind of come to this from a bit more of a sort of realpolitik perspective, where I think that this is something where I think countries are likely to regard this as something, or certainly, well, I think Britain is likely to regard this as something where it's going to want to have its own, in some sense, its own expertise, or its own setup.
Absolutely.
But I think the broader point that brings all of this together is that that a country like Britain actually needs to think about how it's going to, or the British government needs to think about how it wants to structure a community or an organisation or whatever in such a way that it will be prepared to advise them when there is an emergency.
I was good. I suppose I was thinking. I was thinking from if let's say from a world perspective, and possibly WHO sort of looking over this, that that from a WHO perspective, I would think that there are undoubtedly, looking around the world, I would think there are a whole lot of countries that just don't have the kind of expertise to do modelling, or indeed other expertise to help them manage pandemics, and we really need to provide support for them. Then I would think there's a next size up of country which has a reasonable level of modelling expertise and reasonable and so on, and they're doing okay. And then I would think there are these the other extreme. There are some equally also troublesome countries that think they know it all, and need to be kept in dialogue with other countries just to remind them that perhaps they don't.
I've just noted my other meeting's just started, so I really do need to,
okay, Chris,
to drop off. Anyway, I'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Okay, should we wrap up then? There. Yeah, that was a really interesting discussion. I think there's still lots of things that we can add in. So I was going to suggest that I stitch it all together. I know it might feel early days, but I think if we want to give sort of lots of time to our fellow experts, we probably want a couple of iterations of it sort of as one document first. But if you're sort of editing your own bit, do feel free to kind of edit in a separate document and then just cut and paste.
Can we all edit the same document if we make edits? Yeah, okay. Great.
Yeah. And yeah, feel free to sort of accept changes if you're making format changes, so it's not horrible to read and things like that. So maybe
which document should I be putting stuff in?
Yeah, so I think I'll make a document. So take each person's sort of section. And Peter, I wasn't sure where we were going to fit in your inverse models. Were we going to try to include that in 7 technical?
I think it was in the technical bit, because I think it's still speculative. I don't think it's a thing. It's a technical challenge to get that working, but it's really cool.
Is it not? I just think to keep editing less confusing, I think it may be good to keep it separate. And they're numbered in succession. Maybe the numbering might need some adjustments. I don't know, but I
think it's probably easier just to read a document and we can all read it. And
if we could do it in LaTeX, I would suggest you did it with with a LaTeX main file that input the various things. And if you do that, then it's easy to have people edit their own bit, but be able to view it as part of a whole document.
I suppose it eventually becomes out.
I'm not sure if there's anything you can do in Word that's similar.
Well,
since the last time we talked, I have realised we have an institutional Overleaf account, so I do have access to a professional one if it's worth setting that up.
You could set that up, and we would all be able to.
We could have as many collaborators, on each paper as we need.
When we used Overleaf before for one of the early things, it was quite confusing when a lot of people were editing simultaneously. I don't know whether other people had that experience, but I've
only done it with 2 or 3 collaborators before.
Yeah,
and it
there
was
were
fine
quite
then,
a
but
few,
I
and
can
it was.
understand.
I mean, at least the sections will be separate, but they'll just be in one document, so it's fairly clear to see what's your section, I think.
Yeah.
And then we can then go and move them about.
And if we simply add comments and so on, rather than, I mean, if it's not your section, then we simply comment rather than overwriting things. Then whoever owns that section can go back and rewrite to take account of the comments as they see fit. That ought to work okay. So rather than all editing everybody's sections, if we just sort of track suggested changes and comments, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. So for now, should we just stick with the Dropbox sort of Word setup? And if we find we want something fancier, we can do that later. Okay. So I'll make a document, just stick everything together. then yes, as Valerie said, we can sort of go through and comment on the sections, and we can have more of a discussion of the ones we haven't spoken about next week as well. And then we should have sort of 2 iterations or so before we have to think about sending it to anyone else. Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks
Cool.
very much. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Lisa. Bye.
Bye-bye.